All right, today we shall talk about feet.
Not like that, you creepy pervs.
Looking back at my early YouTube days when I shared newbie sparring footage, it looks really clumsy to me now, and the reason is I didn't know proper footwork back then. And that's something that is not covered as much. I mean, swinging swords is more interesting than just stepping, right? And the manuscripts often leave that out or don't give you a whole lot of information about footwork because they just assume that people would know the basics, that somebody has already taught them and they weren't supposed to learn that off the manuscript. Anyway, so starting out, here's one way to establish a solid base. You start with your feet comfortably placed shoulder width apart. Then you take one fairly long step back with the toes of the rear foot pointing at about a 45-degree angle, and you sink into the stance while keeping your body upright. That's the basic. Now, there are styles with different stances, and there are some guards that stand a little differently. It may be more upright with the feet at a more extreme angle, like in saber fencing, for example. It could be a lot further apart, but generally this is what I would recommend starting out with. Important to note here, the weight should be mainly on the balls of the feet. You don't have to lift the heels off, but you should have most of the weight on the balls of the feet because this is just more agile. This way you can push off easily, you can change pretty quickly, you can redistribute the weight, etc. It's same as in many unarmed martial arts. And so the basic neutral stance would be about 50-50% weight distribution so that you don't lean heavily on either one or the other. But in the middle of a fight, depending on what you're doing, depending on the position, on the guard and the technique, you may shift the weight either to the front or the back. Okay, so here are the most important steps. One, passing step. This happens very often because this would be the step that you use to get into measure, meaning a distance where you can strike the opponent. And it's sort of like walking, but it's a lot more controlled because you have that low stance for better stability and balance. And ideally, you power the step with your hips. So the hips are really what drive forward and are what change the leg position. So the better you become at this, the more quickly you can change. Note the foot position here. The toes are pointed slightly outward on the front foot. The reason for that is so that you don't accidentally collapse the knee inward, because if you load the knee with your weight in this position, it's likely to get injured. In this position, it's weak because it's twisted out of alignment. This way, the leg goes in the same direction that the toes are pointed in, so the toes, knee, and thigh are all in alignment, and this way you can actually load that leg without risking injury. And the toes on the rear foot are generally at a 45-degree angle. They can be further out as well, but typically not just straight forward. So when taking a step, you have to change the position of this foot so it matches the rear foot on the other side because you're reversing everything, right? So there are two ways of doing it. Either you turn your foot first and then you step, or you step and then you rotate this foot. This is what I prefer doing because this doesn't telegraph the way that does, and you get a little bit of an extra snap at the end. Next is the advancing and retreating step. This may seem familiar to you from modern Olympic fencing. So you push off with the rear leg, take a step forward with the front leg, and then the rear leg follows. So 1, 2, 1, 2, and reverse, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And everything else should be properly aligned. So you don't want to lurch or shift the position of your upper body in any way. So this takes a certain amount of lower leg strength because you want to really push off like this as opposed to just kind of fall forward the way you normally would when walking. It's basically controlled falling when you think about it. So you want to basically push off with your calf and then the other leg follows. And this can be very fast. The gathering step is very similar, except that you start with the opposite leg. So you bring that one in, gather it, and then the other foot comes forward. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And important here is that you don't straighten out in the middle of it. So you don't really want to bob your head up and down. You can't see my head right now, obviously, but so you want to ideally keep your head level, just bend the legs the way they need to, and then you step. So the nice thing about this is that you can change what you want to do in between. So if I start a gather and the opponent does something that makes me not want to continue forward like this, I can absolutely move sideways. Or I can gather, step sideways with the other leg. I can gather and decide, you know what, let's not. This also allows you to cover a lot of distance by gathering into a lunge. So gather, lunge, and then you can return to a more neutral stance. Then you've got the triangle step, which allows you to laterally move around your opponent. So you step out sideways or diagonally, and then the other leg follows, and then you, at the same time, you turn, you pivot on your heels, so you face the opponent again. Because when I do this, I face the camera, now I'm facing over here, away from the camera. So I take that step to reorient myself and face the camera again. Same on the other side, step, 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 step. So you can cover quite a bit of ground here by pushing off aggressively. There is another way which I'm less familiar with, but should probably practice some more because it can also be quite useful. Basically the same thing except with crossing your legs. Now this seems riskier because you're kind of in a compromised position here. You know, this moment here when you cross your legs, you can much more easily be pushed over or trip and fall. But if you practice this a lot and you get good at it, it's not really a problem, especially if you do it quickly enough. So boom, you know, that doesn't really leave as much room for your opponent to trip you up. And the nice thing is that you cover quite a lot of ground. You can also do it forward. So you can step like this and then pivot out. So this really moves you quite a bit laterally. So in order to practice these, you can simply move back and forth. Like for example, advancing step in one direction, retreating step in the other direction, or gather. And as you get more comfortable, you can combine all of that into one smooth flow. So pass, advance, triangle, gather, pass, advance, and so on and so forth. You can move anywhere you need to. If instead of a passing step, I do kind of a half gather, that's still fine. As long as you keep moving to where you're supposed to. If sometimes I step a little bit over, you know, slightly crossing, that's fine as long as you keep your balance. That's really the important part. In the beginning, if you haven't done this before, this can be pretty hard on your legs if the muscles aren't used to these movements. So take it slow, and it's also a good idea to do certain exercises in a controlled manner to strengthen them. For example, of course, classic squat is useful, you know, bring it nice and low. Lunges are very useful. Balancing on one leg is definitely good. I like to do it forward like this, hands on the back to make it a little more difficult. Walking on your toes, that can also be a good exercise. And generally when practicing these steps, especially passing steps, focus on engaging your core. You know, twist your hip to drive this. So instead of just reaching out with the leg, kind of limply, you want to drive it with the core. So I'm rotating my hips. Don't over rotate, by the way. That's a common issue. A lot of beginners, when they cut, they kind of over rotate where they're no longer facing the target. Again, there are stances where you deliberately face away from the opponent, but you don't want to do that during a cut because that messes with the edge alignment. And the better you get at driving from the hips, the faster these steps are going to be. All right, that's it for now. Hope you found it helpful. You can stop looking at my crotch now. Thanks for watching and have a good one, folks.